Good morning and welcome. Thank you for coming along to our Investor Day. This is the third one of these. I am Dig Howitt, CEO of Cochlear. And these days are an important event for us and hopefully for you, for us to give you some insight into our strategy, our longer term priorities. So it's not a day to talk about this year's financial performance or guidance. It is a view to the future and strategy. So that's the context for us. But thank you for coming along. It's also an opportunity for you to hear from a broader set of our management team, give you exposure to more of our managers than you would see, or executives than you would see in normally just straight after results or in other meetings. So the format for today is we have a series of presentations. We will then have a Q&A session at the end. So if you can hold your questions to the end, we'll have a panel of the speakers that gives you the chance to ask questions then. We have a technology expo that will follow the presentations, and then which was over outside here, and then we'll have lunch up on balcony on level 5 for those who can stay on for that, and again chance to meet with management and executives through the Technology Expo and through lunch as well. And so really what we want to do today is to give some insight into our strategy, and I wanted to do that just by starting with a background overview of Cochlear. Many of you know many of this, but I want to put some slides up just about our Cochlear, then talk about the context for hearing loss, then get into our strategy. So let's go from there. So by way of overview, I think many of you know this. We've got 3,500 employees. We're in over 30 countries. We sell as in our people in over 30 countries. We sell in over 100 countries, and we have a range of both cochlear implants and acoustic implants. It just gives you a sense of the global nature of the business. This looks at our offices, which are clearly spread around the world. And then some more numbers there at the bottom: 475,000 and growing recipients, 150 million in R&D. That was our F17 number. About 1.2 billion in sales revenue, and 5 manufacturing sites there. Okay, so again, a bit of background, and then just some long-run financial view of the business. So on your left, we have our F17 growth numbers, but then on the rest of these charts, looking at long-run unit growth. So you can see unit growth, cochlear implant unit growth has grown over a very long time. Sales revenue, similarly, but a bit more volatile than cochlear implant unit growth, and there's obviously currency coming into that, and there is of course services and acoustic revenue which work differently, don't necessarily grow at the same rate as cochlear implant units. Our net profit, again, long run growth. There's a dip that we all know about coming out of the recall and the Australian dollar going to parity with the US dollar back in 12-13. And then a long history of dividend growth as well. So long run history of growth. We see obviously opportunity for further growth, and that's what we want to talk about today, is where is that opportunity, what are the barriers, and what are our strategies to try to obtain that growth. So let's move to our mission. So start to move now mission context and then into the strategy. You've all seen our mission before, and Cochlear, every company has a mission or a vision of some sort, but at Cochlear it genuinely means a lot to all of our employees, and that's obviously in the nature of the work we do. You'll see the mission is out in the foyer. It sits in the car park so that when people drive in they see it. We don't do that to indoctrinate people. We do that because people believe in it and they want to see it. But there's really 3 elements to our mission that are important, that also set context for our strategy. So obviously we help people hear and be heard, but 3 parts underneath that is that we empower people to have a full life, and that means that hearing isn't just an isolated disease state, isn't just an isolated issue. It is part of living a full life, is to have normal or as close as we can get to normal hearing. The second part, which is critically important, is that we transform the way people understand and treat hearing loss. And I'll talk more about this because this is, I think, the biggest issue for us, the biggest issue for the cochlear implant industry and the acoustic implant industry as well, is that our products are not well known. Hearing loss is highly prevalent. We've got some numbers on that, but it is significantly undertreated as a disease state or as a therapy. There is big opportunity, but that opportunity is challenging to get. And then final part is the innovation. Jan Janssen, our Chief Technology Officer, will talk more about that. This is ingrained in Cochlear's heritage, is a focus on innovation, commitment to R&D. That is really important part of who we are. It's a very important part of our market leadership position, and we'll talk more about that through the morning. So that's our mission. And then it's worth looking at hearing loss in context. So hearing loss is one of the most prevalent medical conditions in the world. It is also one of the least treated. And to the extent that now the World Health Organization over the last several years has taken much more of an interest in hearing loss. There was a resolution passed last year by the World Health Organization on hearing loss. They now estimate that more than 460 million people around the world have some form of disabling hearing loss. Nearly 1 in 3 people over 65 have a significant level of hearing loss. And there is some data from a few years ago out of the UK that indicates that 8 in 100 people over 70 have a severe to profound hearing loss. So it's a very, very significant disease state right through people's life. When we look then at that clinical need and then say, well, what is the potential opportunity in the segments that we're interested in, and we'll talk about those segments in a few minutes. We said that for cochlear implants there are potentially 7.5 million people around the world who would benefit. Now it's very important, that's a clinical need. It is absolutely not demand. The number is bigger than that again if you go into emerging markets and include all the adults. But I'll talk more about the segments, and that's an important evolution of our strategy, is to think about the opportunity in terms of segments and therefore our actions in each segment. But anyway you look at this market is very underpenetrated in terms of potential. So that's in terms of the clinical opportunity, not necessarily in terms of what is real demand, and I'll talk more on that. So from that really leads into what are our strategic priorities, what is our strategy, and as always at Cochlear we think very long term in terms of our strategy. I think one of the strengths of Cochlear from the very, very early days was to look very long term and to think about the opportunity, to think about strategy, and the most obvious examples of that going back in history were some of the technology decisions made in the early days of Cochlear were done with a very long run view and set the company up very well for the future by making some very, very important technology choices early, which had a long-term return on them. But there are really three elements to our strategy that I wanted to talk about. The first of those is that we retain market leadership. The second is that we grow the hearing implant market. And the third is that we do this in a financially sustainable way, both in terms of revenue growth and profit growth. So the first one of those is to retain market leadership. And the simplest reason for that is just the economics. In any industry, as you well know, the economics of leadership are compelling. It is particularly true in this business. There are advantages of scale in manufacturing, in R&D. The value of leadership in terms of the ability to invest is very, very important. So it's important that we retain that leadership. And two of the important elements of that are our commitment to R&D, making sure that we have world-leading, market-leading technology, and we continue to push the boundaries on technology. And the second part is the experience that our customers have is very important, and I want to talk more about that. And that's both from a consumer but also from a professional customer perspective. The second, and this gets back to the middle bit of our mission, is growing the market. And this is transforming the way people understand and treat hearing loss. And there are 3 parts to that: awareness and access, and all of this has to be underpinned by clinical evidence, because it's clinical evidence that gives people the reason, the motivation to get a cochlear implant. It gets to professionals about why people should refer, and it's also for payers on why should payer pay for a cochlear implant, which is an expensive intervention. So we'll talk more on that. And then finally, delivering consistent revenue and earnings growth. We have done that over a long term. We continue to aim to do that, and I'll talk more about that to finish up. So let's get into some of the detail on that, and starting with retaining market leadership before moving through each of these. So our investment in R&D is very, very important. We continue to invest around 12% of our revenue in R&D. We want to hold it about that level. We think that's about the right level to be able to advance our technology. And very importantly, this is where scale comes in, is we can, with our investment in R&D, move forward on all of the technology fronts. So we can continue to advance implants, implant design. We can with sound processors, the connectivity of sound processors, and the clinical software that professionals use. So advancing and doing that for both cochlear implants and acoustic implants is very important. But the advantage of our scale is that we can push all three of those, which strengthens our competitive position. But we can also use this, as Jan will talk about, to help remove barriers to growth in each of the segments. So importantly, thinking forward about R&D and our technology, what do we want to do? We really want to continue to expand here. We want to deliver excellent hearing outcomes. Hearing with a cochlear implant or acoustic implant isn't the same as natural hearing. There is a gap. There will always be a gap, but we can continue to close that gap with advances in technology. Indications are important. One of the changes in the implant industry over a long time is that the indications, so the people who benefit, has expanded as the technology has improved. And obviously with that expansion, the potential market opens up, as does the challenges of turning that clinical need into demand. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then lifestyle. So the easier it is for people to use our products, the more integrated they are into everyday life. So connections to phones, accessories, and so on, that the better acceptance, the better outcomes, very important part of technology leadership. And finally, connected care, and we will talk a bit about connected care. This is an opportunity into the future, thinking about how do we use cloud connectivity, and we already have some things going to help improve outcomes and to help improve efficiency across the continuum of care through people's lives. Second part of retaining market leadership is the experience our customers have, and this is important from several perspectives. The first and most important is that the outcomes, the experience people have, that's what we're here for, is to give people the best hearing outcome they can. The better we can do that, the more likely people are to be satisfied and therefore to talk to people about the benefits they've got from an implant and to refer others on. So making sure that people have a great experience is critical to our brand, critical to their outcome, and therefore to future potential and to growth. The second part of that is engagement, and one of the things we've been talking about for the last few years is how can we engage in an appropriate way but more actively with the over 400,000, 475,000 people who have one of our implants. And the reason for doing that is to help improve the outcomes. It is to help them get the best from the technology. And it is also obviously to make them aware of new technology. So our services business, which is a very important part of our revenue, we know services revenue increases, the better engaged people are, so we want to continue to drive that engagement. The second part of that is that one of the most important aspects of someone deciding to get a cochlear implant or acoustic implant is to talk to someone like them, is to speak to someone who's walked down the road before them of hearing loss and hearing aids potentially, and then a decision to get a cochlear implant or an acoustic implant. So we have a broad network of volunteers across the globe now, and we continue to expand that, but those volunteers, people being able to get advice from someone like them is very, very important part of the decision to get an implant. So building the volunteer network, which is part of engagement, very important for us. And finally, it is the lifetime relationship. The implant people have, we wanted them to keep that for their life. The sound processors do need to be replaced through wear and tear, and obviously with improvements in technology, people can get better hearing outcomes over time. So that lifetime relationship is very important. We need to make sure that we have good data, we have connection with people so that they have the reason to engage and continue to get great outcomes. So this whole world-class customer service, very important part of retaining market leadership. So let's from there move on to growth and how do we drive growth? And as the industry leader, it is an obligation on us to stimulate growth in the industry, and that is turning, as I said, this clinical need into demand. And there are important parts to that which are really about awareness and access, both of which have opportunities. But we do think about this more and more in terms of segments. And so what we want to do is really talk about each of these segments and how our business has evolved with changes in these segments, and then what's the opportunity and the activities that we can undertake to stimulate demand in each of these segments. So three important segments, and we've talked about these for a while now. Adults and seniors in the developed market, this certainly has big potential. We estimate that the global penetration in developed markets is around 3%. This is people typically with age-related hearing loss, but it does include people who have a sudden hearing loss. I'll talk a little bit more about them. Children in the developed markets is pretty highly penetrated, so we think it's about 60% penetrated. It's where Cochlear started, and I'll talk more on that. And then finally, children in emerging markets. So those three segments make up both the segments have different characteristics, potentially different growth opportunities, and therefore we have different actions in each of these segments to drive growth. And that's what I want to talk more about now. So put that in context, I'll talk about how has the cochlear implant industry developed. So if you go back to 1978, if you go back to Graham Clark, the first implants we did were in adults and in post-lingually deaf adults. And that's the obvious place to start because you want to know if the product works. To do that, you want to be able to get the easiest response you can. So someone who can already speak and who has heard is the best place to start. So cochlear implants started in adults. When Cochlear started, the first approvals were for adults. After it was proven that the technology worked for adults, it went very quickly to try in newborn children. Therefore, children who have never heard but can't hear, does a cochlear implant work? In the early 80s, it was proven that cochlear implants did work for children that hadn't heard, and that then became the very compelling value proposition. So being able to have a child go from a profound hearing loss to hearing, to being able to attend normal schooling, the economics of that are very, very compelling. And so that's where cochlear implants grew up from, really from the mid-80s through to about 2009 or 10. A lot of our growth was on the back of children in the developed markets. And as the outcomes were proven, it became clearer that the earlier children got implants, the better they did. That led to the need for newborn hearing screening so that children could be diagnosed early. As outcomes were proven, reimbursement followed, first for one implant, then as bilateral implantation was shown to have benefits both in terms of outcomes and economics. 2 implants were approved. So there was a series of outcomes with better evidence leading to changes in indications, leading to better funding, that meant that the penetration of children in developed markets grew pretty rapidly through from the mid-80s through to about 2009 and 10. When that market started to get saturated. So from Cochlear's perspective, around 2009-10, we realised we had to shift our focus from children in developed markets to both adults and seniors where there was an opportunity and to children in emerging markets. And that's where our thinking first started, and it's as we've refined the opportunity and as children become more penetrated in developed markets, we have focused more and more on adults, seniors and children emerging. So I want to talk more about that in some detail now. So the biggest opportunity that we have looking forward is adults and seniors in the developed market. And the barriers there are absolutely about awareness and access. So typically people in this segment have a progressive hearing loss. There are some that have sudden hearing loss, and typically with a sudden hearing loss through an accident, through a disease of some form, they act pretty quickly because they've had hearing, they've lost hearing, they want to get it back, they take action. The much harder part and the much bigger part of this segment is people on a progressive decline. So slowly losing hearing, slowly adapting their lifestyle to being able to hear less. Typically they will get hearing aids at some point on that journey. For many of them, hearing aids will be a very good solution through the rest of their lives, but for a proportion, their hearing loss will deteriorate to a point at which hearing aids are no longer particularly effective. And they then become candidates for cochlear implant or an acoustic implant. And what we see as the technology has improved is that the point at which they would get a greater benefit from a cochlear implant over a hearing aid moves earlier in that journey. And there's evidence starting to emerge on that, but we need to do more, which we will talk about today, to pull that evidence together in a way that makes sense, that is very clear, and that the studies are very have great integrity in terms of the size and scale and so on. So in this area, we need evidence of the effectiveness relative to other interventions like hearing aids, but we also need evidence of why should people treat hearing loss as important. So it's about hearing and healthy ageing, that hearing isn't just something that happens to you as you get old and like losing your hair or going grey. It happens, it doesn't really matter. It does matter, and it matters because there are other implications for your overall health. Now there's some evidence on that, we need better evidence on that, and so that's where some of our work will go. And we obviously got to back all of that with the economics. All government health budgets everywhere are under pressure. The interventions that get paid, that get more money, are those which are most economically beneficial. We've got to have the evidence to support that. So that's about the evidence there. Second part is the challenge, and we have part of that we need more. The challenge here is that these people are many of them on a progressive hearing loss. They don't know about cochlear implants. They are in a hearing aid channel which has pretty limited knowledge on cochlear implants. And it's not also a medical channel. Whereas children born deaf, born in a hospital, are in a hospital, in a medical channel. It's a much easier referral process for children than it is for adults and seniors. So adults and seniors are much more challenging to turn that clinical need into demand for the reasons of it being a slow decline, for them being in the hearing aid channel, which is not in a medical channel. And we continue to work with trying to get into the hearing aid channel, to understand the hearing aid channel. It's the reason that we bought Cycle, and many of you know Cycle. So Cycle is a hearing aid practice management software company based in San Francisco that we bought about 12 months ago. Now, it has about 70% of the US market for hearing aid practice management. So it sits in the middle of this channel where many of our future customers in this adults and seniors segment sit. And so our reason for the acquisition is not only is it a great standalone business, but it gives us the opportunity to learn about this channel more, hopefully to educate this channel with the right clinical evidence on when should a referral to a cochlear implant be considered over a hearing aid. So very important. We are starting slowly in terms of thinking about how we use Cycle, how we can experiment with Cycle to educate in that channel to start to realise this opportunity. And the final part that is a challenge to turning the clinical need into demand is indications. So indications for cochlear implants vary around the world. In some markets, Germany, US, Australia as an example, now Japan, the indications are pretty broad and broadly match where a cochlear implant is effective, or at least should be considered. And we would say that is greater than a 70 decibel hearing loss. It is less than 5 words out of 10 in best aided condition with a hearing aid. So clearly with a hearing aid, it's with 70 decibel hearing loss. So some significant hearing loss, at that point we think cochlear implants should be considered. However, in many countries the indications are still at a 90 decibel hearing loss, which was where cochlear implants were 10 and 15 years ago. It's where cochlear implantation started, people having profound hearing loss. And that's where there is a gap in indications, but there's also therefore a gap in professional knowledge that many people understanding of what a cochlear implant does is still in the 90 decibel or more hearing loss, not at 70 decibels. So we've got expanded indications, but with evidence, but also that leads back to the education. And the other part is funding. Expansion of indications doesn't always lead to expansion in funding. That's often separate. We need to work on funding. We are increasing our focus on market access, hiring people with market access experience to make sure that we can again pull this evidence together to lobby for funding to demonstrate why hearing loss should be better funded than it is. But in many markets in which we operate, there are caps on funding. If we don't remove those caps, then there are clear constraints on our long-run growth. So that's adults and seniors. I've spent a bit of time on that because it is the biggest opportunity for us, and it is one that we are putting a significant part of our effort and focus on at the moment. And as I said, and underpinning that segment is clinical evidence. We have to have really good evidence of why people should think beyond a hearing aid, why a cochlear implant is effective, why it's economically effective. The evidence there is emerging, and there's some references on this slide to that, but we still need to do more on building the evidence base to support when a cochlear implant or an acoustic implant should be prescribed. Children in developed markets, as I said, this is where Cochlear grew up in many respects. The economics here are very well understood. The penetration in most developed markets is very high. In Australia, for newborns, it's over 95%. Most of Western Europe, it's over 80%. There are markets where there are further opportunities. US, Japan, France and Korea also have slightly lower rates. But when you think about this part, there is an opportunity. If we could take penetration from 60% to 80%, that's nice growth. But birth rates are typically flat or declining in these countries. So there's not a huge opportunity for growth in children in the developed world. It's a very important segment because it has huge lifetime value. We have done very well over time in this segment. We continue to work very hard in there. There is opportunity in terms of expanding bilateral indications across country. And there is also opportunity for children who are past the newborn hearing screen, but then lose hearing before they get to school. So we still hear in many countries of several instances of children turning up to school with significant hearing loss who were hearing, not getting diagnosed. So there is an opportunity still there for us, but it's far less, far smaller than the other two segments that we're looking at. And then our third segment is children in emerging markets. So with this, the economics here, the reason to act, the outcomes are all the same as children in the developed world. The issues are much more about the ability to fund in countries, and we see that expanding over time. Awareness of cochlear implants is important. It's low but growing. And we need to make sure that we continue to expand our presence in these markets, both through distributors and our own people, but also to develop the infrastructure and the capability. So that's whether that's surgical training, audiological expertise in terms of diagnosis, or the speech therapy, the therapy post-implantation to get really good outcomes. Typically that doesn't exist until we and others get involved to start the education and the development of that. And we've done that over the last 20 years across many countries. There are still many more that we can do. And if you look at, in emerging markets, China is one that stands out, where now penetration is probably somewhere between 20 to 30% for newborns. So it's going well, but there are equally markets below 1%. So long run opportunity here. These markets are much more inconsistent in terms of implant rates and implant growth. Few reasons for that. Some of just the economics of many of these countries might be oil price dependent. So if the oil price drops, the number of implants drops. Parts of these markets are run in tenders, and tenders you can win or lose. We talk about the China tender over the years quite a bit. If you miss then a tender, you therefore have a dip in units and revenue that corresponds to that. So they're much more inconsistent in terms of revenue, but the underlying growth rate has been very encouraging, and there is certainly long-run opportunity as wealth increases in these countries. And what we see typically is that there'll be a public component, government-funded component to these markets, and a private component. And often the two of those grow in parallel, not always, but quite often, that as the public funded segment grows, then awareness increases, the evidence of outcomes is there, and that opens the opportunity for a private pay segment that sort of grows on the back. And China is perhaps the best example of that, where we have seen growth in both the public market and the private market as awareness and outcomes have grown. And typically there we have a tiered product offering, because there are different price points to cope with different socio-economic bands, and so we want to get our latest technology in, but we also tend to use a few generation old technology, which still gives excellent outcomes, but we can do that at a lower price than our premium. So very important long-term emerging markets and for children. And if you just project forward to the really long term, there is an opportunity for adults in these markets as well. It's the obvious segment that I haven't talked about today. Quite deliberately, it's not where our focus is now. But if you go back 20 years, our focus was on children in the developed markets and not particularly seniors and adults. In developed markets now, it is very much seniors and adults. I don't know if 20 years is the right time frame for emerging markets, but there is clearly an opportunity somewhere out into the future for adults and seniors in emerging markets. But as I said, many barriers in the way for the adults and seniors of turning that clinical need into genuine demand, which is where people understand, know what a cochlear implant is, they know what the indications are, both from a personal and professional, and someone will pay for it. Those things are complicated to put in place, and that's really where our strategy is aimed, is putting those steps in place. So let me finish with the third leg of the strategy, which is about delivering consistent revenue and earnings growth. So here is a chart showing our revenue growth over time, looking at segments. So I said earlier on that and several times, we must turn this clinical need into demand. That is critical for our implant system growth, is converting clinical need to demand. Critical for our overall revenue growth is that we grow implant systems, we grow services, and we grow acoustics. We have to grow all three to make sure that we maintain our revenue growth. You can see over time we have done that. I've talked a lot about implants. I think services we have talked about in the past, but just to touch on that, it is the most important. There are many important parts to service, but one is growing the recipient base. As we grow our customer base, the opportunity for service business expands. Within that, we then want great experience, which I talked about, and connection with our customers so that they are aware of new technology. And there is a very strong market access component to this too, that upgrades need to be funded for them to be taken up in high levels, and therefore we've got to continue to work with government to continue funding of upgrades or expand funding of upgrades, because in emerging markets it's quite rare for a government to fund an upgrade sound processor at the moment. And then finally, acoustics. So acoustics is very similar to cochlear implants in terms of the potential market there, the potential opportunity in terms of expanding and the adults and seniors segment being important. But we also have in acoustics an opportunity for geographic expansion. When we look at our acoustics business, it's quite focused in a smaller set of countries than the cochlear implant business is. We are over time expanding the range of countries in which we offer our acoustic implants. And then so finally to finish, we will and do invest to drive growth. We have this growth opportunity in front of us. We believe that the best way for us to create long-term value is to invest in driving growth. So we have said, and will continue to say, that we want to hold our net margin constant while we grow our revenue and invest all of the difference in driving further growth. So we're not aiming to expand our operating margin. We do aim to deliver operating efficiencies through scale and internal improvements, but we want to reinvest all of that back into future growth. Because the key on future growth is we don't know exactly what the what the keys are to unlocking growth. We have to experiment and we have to invest to experiment to really understand how it is that we can get growth. Final one is obviously we will keep our balance sheet is very conservatively geared. We intend to keep it that way. We obviously have a strong dividend payout over time, and we intend to keep that. We obviously review that very regularly. But we can fund, the important point is we can fund our growth from our operating cash flows, and we intend to continue to do that. So let me finish there and now hand over to Jan Janssen. So Jan, many of you know, he's our Chief Technology Officer, and he will talk about innovation and R&D, and he also has some of his team here with him. Keith Walsh is the Head of Sound Processes and Connectivity, and Derek Minahan, who's Vice President of Sound Processes and Clinical Care. So the three of them will talk about our technology. Jan, over to you.